Wendy Byrne, I'm the president of the college, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Lawrence Yang to the college tonight. We heard that he was visiting the UK, we were tipped off, and we quickly snapped him up to give this lecture. He's an expert in the area of stigma and its relationship to culture. He directs the Global Mental Health and Stigma Programme at the College of Global Public Health in New York. I didn't know that existed, I googled it, but it does exist. And my daughter would be very envious. Her whole life's aim is to go and live in New York, so she would envy you. He's published over 100 papers and received many awards. His research focuses on the social factors that influence the course of schizophrenia. We're very lucky to have him here tonight, and I look forward to hearing what he has to say. So that we can bring others into the room who can't get here, if you tweet, please tweet. That's the hashtag RCSiteLectures. You're not on Twitter, are you? You can tag in the lectures. And also the lecture will be filmed. Peter will be filming it, and it'll be put on the website later. I hope you'll be able to stay for some refreshments when the talk has finished. So Dr. Yang, thank you for coming, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Professor Byrne. First of all, I want to thank Professor Wendy Byrne, Professor Peter Byrne, for extending this gracious invitation to have me here come give us lecture to you tonight. To speak in front of the Royal College of Psychiatrists is a great honor. This college has been really a leader in terms of practice and research in psychiatry worldwide. So I am happy to foster an exchange of ideas today. I promise to give you an engaging and interesting lecture. Hopefully we'll have a very lively discussion at the close of it. So, as Professor Byrne mentioned, I am an associate professor at NYU, also adjunct faculty at Columbia University, where I was for 11 years prior to joining NYU. And the title of my talk tonight is The Early Detection of Possible Psychosis in Young People. Is Stigma Linked with Symptoms or the At-Risk Identification? This project is the culmination of a 5-year R01 grant from the National Institutes of Mental Health, and I'm very glad to be able to share with you the initial results today. So, no disclosures. A little bit more about myself, since I'm meeting many of you for the first time. As Professor Byrne mentioned, my work is in the social factors that influence the course of schizophrenia. And my training, as befits a public health institution, is mixed. So my PhD is in clinical psychology, but I have extensive training in medical anthropology as well as psychiatric epidemiology. I lived in China for 2 years when I did my dissertation. And I'm fortunate enough to have a number of grants at this time. So the first is this R01 I'll be speaking about tonight. And we are continuing it with another smaller grant, R21, looking at stigma of genetic attributions. I also have another project, a large project in untreated psychosis in China, another R01, and another grant looking at reducing stigma of HIV in Botswana, and I'm involved as well in global mental health in South America. I will not be talking about that work at all tonight, but just to let you know that my work spans several areas. So, tonight, I am breaking up the talk into 2 parts. The first, as I agreed upon with my good colleague, Peter, I'm going to start with an overview and hitting the high notes of stigma and stigma's effects on mental health, which I presume you're all here because you're interested in learning about. And so I'm going to talk about 3 major factors or aspects of stigma. First being public stigma, the second being how stigma impacts the individual. So this includes both experienced discrimination and self-stigma. And then lastly, I'll touch briefly upon structural stigma. This will form the foundation by which we can then launch into the second part of today's talk, which is stigma and the clinical high-risk state for psychosis. And here I will present some of our initial findings from the R01, as well as a set of qualitative findings in order to really further flesh out those quantitative findings. So, a definition of stigma. So stigma is understood to be a set of interrelated social processes, and this is a famous, very widely utilized definition of stigma proposed by my mentors, Bruce Link, Joe Phelan from Columbia. We were all there together. And it consists of a set of concepts that all act together in order to really elicit stigma among people, among marginalized groups. So the first concept is that of labeling. So when there's a difference, it's then given a label, which then might elicit a set of stereotypes. So let's just, and this is my chance to engage the audience. So for a label of, let's say, psychosis or schizophrenia, what are the stereotypes that might be associated with it? And in order to answer this question, regrettably, we have to cast aside sort of, we understand that stigma is wrong, essentially, something that we must all very actively combat in both our practice and our everyday interactions with others. But putting that aside for a moment, let's just think about the general society. What do people think of when they hear schizophrenia? What are the different stereotypes?
Violent.
Yes, regrettably so. Violence, absolutely. That's violence towards itself or other?
Violence towards others.
Others in particular, sure. What else?
Unpredictable.
Unpredictable. Yes, another regrettable stereotype. So those are definitely two that jump off the top of most people's minds. What else?
Uncurable.
Okay, yes, another regrettable stereotype, cannot be cured.
Madness.
Madness. So again, right, not rational. Very good. And what else? We're missing a big one. Split personality, another sort of misnomer. We all know that that's completely separate from schizophrenia, but in the common conception, absolutely. How about productivity? Ability to work, produce in society? Okay, so, right, so regrettable again, but unproductive, unable to sort of sustain work or meaningful contributions to society. So what happens as a result of these stereotypes, when the stereotyping is complete, the next process is that of cognitive separation. So again, when the stereotypes have taken place, then there's a separation of us and them. Then the next process is that of emotional reactions. So let's say if you were a person with schizophrenia and you are aware of all these stereotypes, how might you then feel? What would be an emotional reaction that a person with schizophrenia might feel?
Exclusion.
Absolutely, exclusion, right? Different. What else?
Depressed.
Depressed, absolutely.
Hopeless.
Hopeless. I heard ashamed, absolutely. Regrettable, again, but all these things come again, unfortunately, with a possible label that could occur. So then emotional reactions also include the reactions of people from society. So what might that include? Rejection, that's a good one. Fear, absolutely, right? People with schizophrenia elicit fear, unfortunately. What else? Anything positive?
Pity.
Pity, absolutely. So that is quasi-positive, I suppose. It's not exactly the most empowering message, but it's sort of on the, I suppose, more positive side of the ledger. Excellent. So then what can occur is status loss and discrimination. So this can occur both on the individual level, person to person, or institutional. And then lastly is power. Power is necessary for all of these processes to unfold and then actually adversely impact the individual. These then all lead to poor symptoms and social outcomes. And these are shown by classic studies by Bruce Link, Pat Corrigan. So let me go through each one again in brief. So I'm going to go through each concept, public stigma, starting with public stigma. So this is the process in which the general public stigmatizes individuals with mental illness, and which consists of classic processes of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. I'm going to also provide an exemplar study for every concept, so really illuminate it. So public stigma globally, perhaps the most well-known, most illustrative studies, is a cross-national study of the backbone of public stigma of mental illness. This is Bernice Presco-Salido, 2013. In this study, she did a study of nationally representative samples in 16 countries, and she gave respondents DSM-4 vignettes of major depression and schizophrenia. The samples are over 13,000 community members, and she identified core sentiments that represent consistent, salient public health intervention targets. And what she did was 5 of these items actually emerged. She calls them the core or the backbone of stigma, endorsed by about 2/3 of respondents across all of these settings. So 3 of them have to do with the family. So other people view, they're unwilling to have people with mental illness care for their children, have them marry into the family, and they believe they shouldn't teach children. Okay, so basically stay away from the family. And then also, as we just said earlier, coherent with what we said earlier, likely to be violent to self rather than other, and then unpredictable. Moving on to the next concept, how stigma impacts the individual. The first is, well, quite intuitive. So you can be treated badly by other people, so experience discrimination. This is when an individual is unfairly treated by another individual based on their status of having mental illness. And perhaps the best study of this is done by Graham Thornycroft. I'm sure known to many of you here. Over 700 individuals with schizophrenia, 27 different countries, so all over the world. And the main findings here were that from this sample, 47% reported negatively being affected in keeping friends, 43% were treated differently by families. So again, unfortunately, it's a widespread experience of being negatively treated by another person based on their status. Discrimination also is associated with greater numbers of years ill, and then it also increases with this concept of anticipated stigma, which I'll get into in a second, and compulsory treatment. All right, so the second part of being how a person is individually affected by stigma is that of internalized stigma. And this is actually the most well-researched area of stigma and its effects on individuals. Internalized stigma, takes place through stigmatized individuals themselves. Once they become aware of stereotypes and apply stereotypes to themselves. So what's really crucial about this form of stigma is that nobody has to treat you badly in order for the negative effects to unfold. And I'll illustrate that for you all in just one moment. So an illustrative study is, again, Professor Thornycroft's study. And I'm going to talk about anticipated stigma here, which is very closely related to internalized stigma. So essentially, this is when people have this a new status of having schizophrenia, let's say, then they will anticipate, other people are not going to accept me based on X, Y, or Z. So 64% anticipated stigma in finding work, 55% in intimate relationships, and 72% felt the need to conceal their diagnosis. And again, these are across these 27 countries, so it's widespread. I want to present to you all this is perhaps the most influential model of internalized stigma in the field. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this model because I think that, first of all, it gives us a way of understanding how stigma works. But then, just as important, it provides a way for us to map out how can we counter the worst effects of stigma. So this is the modified labeling theory. This is done, proposed by my, dear mentor, Bruce Link, 1989. And let me just start with the first step. So the first step is that as people, as part of a society, we grow up with an understanding of how people think about mental illness, how people think about psychosis or schizophrenia, for example. All right, so just earlier, we heard a set of stereotypes, right? Dangerous, unpredictable, madness, not able to be so productive at work. So just, again, being embedded as part of society, we grow up with these conceptions in our head. So let's say we're lucky, and we're never identified with having psychosis or schizophrenia. Well, so we're in this bottom pathway here. So we're not labeled, we're aware of these stereotypes, but you know what? Doesn't bother me, right? Because nobody identifies me as that, so there are no consequences due to labeling. So let's go to the upper pathway. Let's say that you start to experience, voices or delusions, or to have some symptoms of psychosis or schizophrenia. And then you go into a mental health service. So you meet with a social worker, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and then you are told that you have psychosis or schizophrenia. Actually, let me just pause here for a moment because I realize I'm talking at a psychiatry organization, and also this reflects my personal belief. diagnosis is absolutely necessary. It is the foundation, really, of our medical system, and it gives us the ability to identify, give prognosis, and treat, right? And so all of those are powerful goods that happen, of course, when a person is identified. However, there can be a complementary set of negative consequences that occur. And so this model illustrates these possible negative consequences, and to the extent that we can, we ought to think about how can we minimize these while preserving the good. So when a person comes in and they're identified with psychosis or schizophrenia, and all of a sudden the person is has to come to terms with, oh, I have these conceptions of, oh, this is what people think about psychosis and schizophrenia, and all of a sudden, oh my, they apply to me. So when I go out into society, people are going to think I'm violent, I'm dangerous, I can't work. And so as a result of this, people, of applying these stereotypes to the self, then people basically can choose a set of coping strategies. And these are the negative ones here, classic negative ones. If you were identified with psychosis or schizophrenia, and you anticipated other people would think X, Y, or Z about you, you might be less likely to go out, essentially, to be very secretive, stay inside your home, or withdraw, so you only stay among people who happen to know your status and accept you for it. As a result of these coping responses, this can then lead to negative self-esteem, earning power, or social network ties. Quite simply because you might not go for that job interview, that you had planned on going for because you're afraid of answering questions about leave of absence from work. Or, you may not hang out with your friends because they might ask you uncomfortable questions about where you may have been the last several weeks. Because of these negative social reactions, this then leads to, psychosocial outcomes. This may then lead to a vulnerability to repeated episodes of psychosis or schizophrenia. It leads to a greater vulnerability. One other thing, so two more things about this slide. This also tells us where we can put our efforts to in terms of trying to decrease stigma. The first is here, the first box, the societal conceptions. And this is where I really have to, again, give a lot of credit to the UK. You have the longest running anti-stigma campaign, national level, time to change, that is a really model for the rest of the world. So we can start here, okay? This is very necessary. And we should, every day, seek to engage on a societal level. When we actually meet with people who we treat or help or diagnose, we can also try to break these links. So after they're identified with psychosis or schizophrenia, for instance, we can try to lessen the stereotype, or we can try to get people to adopt a more healthy coping response, right? Talk to people who they really trust. Seek social support from people they really trust. And so this is what I find so powerful about this model. It tells us, gives us a map in terms of intervening. The last thing I want to mention is that this model was developed in an era when there was no at-risk diagnoses. So this is developed for depression or schizophrenia or a concrete diagnosis. What happens when you tell a youth that they're at risk for something? It's a quasi-diagnosis, right? Does it elicit all of these same consequences, or does it look different? So that's what our work and my presentation today hopefully will illuminate. So the negative effects of internalized stigma are well known. These are all different forms of internalized stigma here on this side. And so internalized stigma, according to a meta-analysis 2010, leads to reduced self-esteem, self-efficacy, quality of life, leads to increased depressive symptoms, and worse, psychosocial medication adherence, as well as social support. Just for completeness, the last form of stigma is that of structural stigma. So very briefly, these are institutional practices that work to disadvantage the stigmatized group or person. And some examples include countries spending far less gross domestic product on mental health and physical health, again, unfair disparity, and then secondly, some countries forbidding people with mental illness rights and privileges, for instance, to vote. Okay, so that is the end of my first unit, and so I'm going to go on to the second part, which is about stigma and the clinical high risk. So I want to be very clear here. Today I'm going to be talking about the clinical high-risk state for psychosis. This is terminology that's used in the United States. So I believe in Europe it's maybe more frequently referred to as ultra-high risk or the at-risk mental state. But regardless of the specific term, what I'm referring to is youth who have not yet developed a first episode of psychosis, have not yet crossed the threshold into a full psychotic disorder. These are youth who are identified with sub-threshold symptoms of psychosis, but who are at increased likelihood of developing psychosis, a full disorder of psychosis, within the next 2 years. And so here, the CHR, and so I'm going to abbreviate this as CHR throughout the talk. So the CHR is the earliest identification of pre-psychotic signs. And if you are identified with these features, you have about a 29, depending on the meta-analysis, but around a 29% chance to transition to psychosis within 2 years. Again, let me be clear about my position on this. I am a firm believer, I'm a public health person, so I'm a firm believer in earliest identification. I think that we ought to try to intervene with youth as soon as we can, as soon as we detect that they're having problems. So, and I think that's a powerful good, both in psychiatry and mental health. But we should try to mitigate any of the negative consequences. So, and these include stigma, which may be associated with identification. So if 29% of youth transition to full psychosis, that means that over 70% do not. And for these over 70%, they could be burdened with the identification of being at risk for psychosis, even though they have over a 70% chance of not developing psychosis, even without any treatment. So we have to understand these processes, I think, carefully. So this has been a blossoming field in this past period of time. I probably was one of the first people to write about it in 2010. And since then, public stigma has been studied for CHR, self-stigma in this set of studies. Nicholas Rush has done amazing work in this area. And most recently, there was a systematic review looking at help-seeking and service contact and stigma with CHR. This was published by, again, a very distinguished British group, Gronholm, Thornercroft, Lawrence, and Evans-Laka, just a couple years ago. There is, however, an unresolved, so in addition to this, I should say, there's an unresolved question that I'm going to try to seek to answer today. And this is, to what extent is the stigma of the CHR due to youth being told that they're at risk for psychosis, okay? So being told, the identification state, versus their symptoms. So their symptoms are the odd perceptual or thinking that brings them into the treatment. And why this is particularly important for CHR is because the weight of one versus the other, it matters, especially in this case. So CHR youth are identified when they're help seeking for these problematic symptoms and experiences. And again, these are sub-threshold, for instance, hallucination delusions. They can include, I see shadows, right, in the corner there. But the hallmark of CHR is that the youth maintain the capacity to reality test. So they will also say in the next breath, but I think my mind's playing tricks on me. That's really weird. That shouldn't be happening to me. All right, so they maintain their insight. So earliest identification and treatment is meant to mitigate symptoms, right? That's the whole point. We want to catch them as early as possible. So if we can catch them early, lessen their symptoms, then in what the argument here is basically that, well, we're not going to let them progress to a more symptomatic state, which would then elicit a lot more stigma, right? Because when you develop the first episode of psychosis, and in particular, if you have to go to the hospital, an involuntary hospitalization, well, that triggers all sorts of stigma. So to the extent that stigma is associated with symptoms, it may be somewhat less of a concern for the CHR field. However, if stigma is associated with a label, so with youth being told they're at risk for psychosis, this may be somewhat more concerning to us as a field, because this is something we're, quote unquote, adding on to the youth's experience, and maybe something that they wouldn't have to experience otherwise. So compounding this is that currently, at least in the United States, there's no consensus on a standard way of communicating the CHR status for all participants in CHR programs. So it's a sort of this gray field of how do you tell youth that when they're at risk for psychosis? How, when, right, what terminology? So specialized CHR program clinicians are typically trained to give individualized feedback based on a wide range of factors. And this really is, so basically it varies from program to program, individual to individual. So it depends on the individual's and family's concerns, the treatment engagement, so really roping the youth into the treatment, cultural background, very important, and then also estimated risk within the CHR classification. So as an example, there could be youth who come into the service who are sort of on the lower aspect, of the spectrum. They have lesser symptoms, and so you might not use the word at risk for psychosis with them. You may say to them something like, "You're at risk for developing more severe mental illness signs," right? That could be a softer way of putting it, as opposed to youth who's right on the cusp and who might develop psychosis tomorrow. So the way that what I really think our contribution is in this study is to differentiate the stigma of the label versus the stigma of symptoms. And prior studies have not really done this. So let me show you how we did this. So you'll see here there are 3 stigma domains that we're most interested in looking at. So the first is negative emotions, which I'm going to call shame in shorthand. Then there's secrecy, and then there's experience discrimination. So those are 3 forms of stigma that correspond to part 1. So the way that we asked the labeling questions, we started them by saying, about being told I'm at risk for developing psychosis. So we're being very explicit. How do you feel now that you've just been told you're at risk for psychosis? So we would start with that and say, I have felt ashamed. For secrecy, I have told no one that I'm at risk for developing psychosis. And then lastly, about being told I'm at risk for developing psychosis, people are a little afraid of me. So we made very clear to make sure that the stigma was attached to the identification process. For the symptoms, we asked the same questions, but with a different stem. So we started here, about my symptoms and experiences. I have felt ashamed. I have told no one about my symptoms and experiences. About my symptoms and experiences, people are a little afraid of me. So this is a relatively new innovation in the stigma field, and again, we thought of particular relevance to this issue. So the main hypotheses, number 1, we want to first of all just compare labeling versus symptom-related stigma. So at the outset of CHR identification, which is greater? Okay, does labeling stigma matter more? Symptom-related stigma matter more? And then 2, to assess to what extent labeling versus symptom stigma are associated with psychological outcomes. So for instance, self-esteem and quality of life, these are classic outcomes. And social outcomes, so social functioning, social networks in CHR youth. So let me just say a little bit about the sample. 169 CHR individuals. People who are working in this field know that these youth are hard to ascertain. They're getting easier to ascertain, unfortunately, because of the numbers of youth who meet these criteria these days. But we did ascertain these youth across 3 settings, so Harvard, Maine, and Columbia University. And we assessed them both just as they came into the service and then 6 months afterward. So it was a 5-year study period. I'm only presenting baseline data today. We're in the midst of analyzing our longitudinal data. And these youth are help-seeking youth who meet 1 or more of these 3 SIP-SOPS criteria. Again, it's the US CHR classification system. I believe in Europe, the CARMS is more frequently used. But they met 1 of these 3 subdiagnoses: attenuated positive symptom syndrome, genetic risk and deterioration syndrome, or brief intermittent psychotic syndrome. I also want to note here, this was a very interesting finding that we have to follow up on later. This study only included those youth who perceived at least some psychosis risk. It's very interesting. There are about 30 or 40 youth in this 169 who do not identify any psychosis risk. So we identified them as being at risk for psychosis. I hear laughs. And totally, I was sort of blown away when I had done some of these interviews, a big chunk of these interviews myself too. And the youth would sit there and say, I'm not at risk for psychosis, why you say, but they recognize they have problems. Anyhow, there are about 30, and quality of life. These are well-known measures in the field. And then for social functioning, we have global functioning social scale. This is a 1 to 10 rating developed for CHR youth, Barbara Kornblatt in the US. And also social networks. So this is total loss of relationships or support. So it's a 1-item scale, or amalgamation of, I should say, several items into one scale. And from the Norbeck Social Support Questionnaire. All right, I'm going to jump right into the findings. So for the first hypothesis, which is greater at baseline? Label stigma versus symptom stigma. And so here, this slide compares them head to head. For this is shame, blue bar being the labeling stigma, and the white bar being symptom stigma. So in terms of shame, youth endorsed more shame towards their odd symptoms and experiences coming into the surface versus being told they're at risk for psychosis. Interesting. What happens with secrecy, it's actually flipped. And this difference is significant. For secrecy, it's the other way around. Youth are more secretive about being told they're at risk for psychosis than their odd symptoms and experiences, which probably coheres with many people's clinical experiences, right? Youth are willing to talk about all the things that are bothering them, but they don't want to give it a name. And then for discrimination, no differences. So here we can see that both forms of stigma are acting or are present. I'm going to go into hypothesis 2, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because it sets up the next several slides. So the outcome here is self-esteem, and then we have the 3 forms of stigma I talked about earlier. We've got shame, we've got secrecy, and then we've got discrimination. Within each form of stigma, there are 2 versions, right? We've got label, shame related to label, and then shame related to the symptoms. And then so on and so forth, same thing in the other 2 forms of stigma. So in the first model, what we did is we put in labeling related shame, or shame to the label, and we saw, is this associated with self-esteem? And it is. So basically, the asterisks indicate a significant relationship. So here we see that shame, related to the label, so being told you're at risk for psychosis, is associated with lower self-esteem. We then put in shame of the symptoms by itself in model 2. So here you can see that the same thing. So shame-related symptoms is also negatively associated with self-esteem when put in by itself. Model 3, we compared them head-to-head. So we put them both into the model. We wanted to see what happened, which emerges as a stronger correlate. And so in this case, you can see that shame of symptoms still emerges as a significant correlate, but the shame of the label no longer does. So in this case, it's actually the shame of the symptoms that emerges as a more strong predictor. And then in model 4, we keep both the shame and the label-related stigma in the model, but then we add a host of covariates, and these include, you can see down here, age, gender, site, race, positive, negative, disorganized symptoms, and general symptoms. So we put all of these covariates into model 4 to see whether or not our findings from model 3 would hold up. And you can see here in this case, in this first stigma variable, that shame related to symptoms is negatively associated with self-esteem. All right, so that emerges as sort of the significant correlate. So I'll go through the rest of this faster. So you can see for secrecy, actually neither of them predict at the end. And then for discrimination, interestingly, discrimination of the label predicts, as opposed to discrimination to the symptoms. And any significant finding in model 4, I highlight with a red box. So in this case, for self-esteem, just to sum up, we have 1 symptom-related, 1 label-related variable. For the next variable, quality of life, the next outcome, we can see for shame, it's actually symptom-related shame emerges as a significant correlate. It's symptom-related secrecy that is actually a trend association, so trend being yellow, okay, so p less than 0.10. And then discrimination, symptom-related discrimination emerges as the significant correlate. So interestingly, for quality of life, we're starting to see there's a stronger relationship of the stigma related to the symptoms rather than the label. In terms of social function, actually, neither scale really emerges as a very strong predictor of social function in terms of shame or secrecy. For discrimination, this is a trend finding. So discrimination of symptoms actually emerges as a trend correlate. And then for the last outcome, that of social network loss, you can see here that, again, shame of the label in this case is significantly associated. We have secrecy to the label is a trend association, and then discrimination due to symptoms is a significant correlate. So I realize these slides are somewhat pretty busy, so we have a summary slide, okay? So here we have the 4 outcomes: self-esteem, quality of life, social scale, social network loss. We have the 3 forms of stigma: shame, secrecy, and then discrimination. And then the gray being label, the white being symptom. And so just simply counting up, there are 6 significant findings. They're all in red and marked with an S. And you can see here that out of these 6 significant findings, 4 of them land with symptoms, stigma, and 2 of them land with labeling stigma. So what this tells us, going back to the original set of questions, is that on balance, it appears to be stigma that's related to the symptoms that appears to be a somewhat more powerful correlate than stigma related to labeling. However, stigma of labeling is present. So I'll return to this at the very end of my talk. Next, I'd like to dive into a qualitative study, and this was to examine the nature of labeling-related stigma, because as I just showed you in the prior set of results, 2 of the 6 findings are significant for labeling. So I wanted this set of data is to really give you a sense of what that's like for the youth. What kind of impacts does it have upon how the youth thinks about themselves? And so here we're examining the subjective experience of being told they're at CHR. So we wanted to qualitatively examine processes including positive effects of being told, identified as CHR. So this could be, for instance, direct interaction with specialized CHR clinicians. It could also be negative effects, so individuals anticipating stigma through, right, because people will treat them differently. And to push the field forward, because there have been a set of qualitative studies at this point looking at a CHR, we wanted to look specifically at the co-occurrence. Diagnosis and labeling is complicated. We have many clinicians in the audience, and the two oftentimes go hand in hand. So I wanted to really try to systematically look at to what extent do the positive and negative effects cohere. So to be very clear here though, this data is from a pilot study. This is prior to the big R01. And the reason why that's important is, well, there are 2 things. So number 1, so this data is only based on 38 youth, and we did this earlier, 2009, 2010, and we wanted to examine the meaning of being told they're at CHR. We weren't able to get everybody just as they came into the clinic, so the interviews took place a little bit around a year after people came in on average. And there's a big standard deviation, so some people we got it just as they came in, some people we got 2 or 3 years in. So there's a big, everything I'm about to tell you, we hope to replicate, all right, in our R01 study. So these findings we should really think of as tentative. What we asked the youth were 2 questions. So what we were after, first of all, was were they treated differently from others due to their CHR identification? So the question that we asked them is there anything that happened to you in terms of how people treated you, good or bad, as a result of being in this CHR program? And probes include, can you give me an example of when you were treated this way? Who treated you this way? Where, when? How did it make you feel? How did you respond to it? The second question was meant to target any potential effects via internalized processes that were related to CHR identification. So the specific question is, in being in this program, you were told you have an increased risk of psychosis compared to your peers. How has this affected how others see you? And so here you can see, we're asking them, what is the impact of being identified this way and how you see yourself, how you think about yourself. So probes include, did being told you're at risk for psychosis change the way you thought about yourself? If so, how? Are you concerned about how others might react to knowing you're at risk status? Would others treat you any differently? For the qualitative analyses, we used in vivo software, and the main advantage of this was that we were able to quantify the overlap between major codes. That's one of the things that you can do with in vivo. And so what we did was we focused on the intersection between the positive and the negative labeling experiences. There's this coefficient that in vivo generates for you. It's called Jacquard's Similarity Index. And what you can just think of it as is it tells you to what extent the themes or codes overlap with one another, so that we're able to look at to what extent do these things co-occur with one another. So again, let me just jump right into the results. I'm going to show you the top 4 positive themes in terms of, and then the top 4 negative. In terms of when youth are identified as being a CHR, what are the 4 sort of top things that they endorse in terms of how they benefit. And again, these are just all spontaneous and qualitatively generated. So here you can see in this table, we've got positive themes. 93% of transcripts mention at least one positive theme, so that's good. It's good for the field. So here's a definition of the theme and then an example. So the first one. First and most frequently endorsed positive theme is an accurate understanding of the CHR risk. And that's kind of a relief. That's what we're hoping that the youth will get from this interaction. So 59% of youth endorse this. And the definition, the youth demonstrates a correct understanding of what it means to have a CHR status using specific language about risk after formal identification. And then a sample quote. It's like having a sore throat. You don't know that it will lead to strep throat. You have something indicating something is wrong, but it might not develop into strep throat. This is literally what we tell the youth, or what the service tells the youth, so it's great that it's basically reported back to you. The second most common positive theme is interpersonal benefits of disclosure. So this is interesting. 50% of youth endorse this, but basically it's when the youth disclose their identification to other people, then other people are more supportive towards them. So that's also, a relief. So an example, other people are more aware of what I'm thinking and feeling because of my CHR status. It's something that they may be more sensitive to me about. They're more supportive. The third most commonly endorsed positive theme are the benefits of the specialized CHR treatment. 33% of respondents. Here they endorse more tailored treatment as a result of receiving specialized CHR services through the identification. So the example here. Treatment at COPE is the name of the CHR clinic at Columbia, has been absolutely amazing. Talking to my therapist, reading different studies, I can think about my symptoms and feelings in a different way. And then the last example is the explanation and legitimization of symptoms. And again, this is a powerful aspect of providing a diagnosis. So 25% of respondents, definition, the process of being identified as a CHR explains and or legitimizes previous experiences of symptoms. So this respondent says, I sometimes use coming to cope as a way to convey the severity of my problems. I have an illness with symptoms that's being treated medically and that it's legitimate. So basically, he's sort of using the diagnosis as a justification to other people in his life that there's something wrong. So let's take a look at the most common negative themes that came up. Here you can see that on 62% of transcripts, at least one negative theme came up. So again, that's quite high, but luckily it's lower than what we see for the positive themes. The most prominent negative theme, probably not surprising, is shame and internalized stigma. So 55% of youth reported this. The CHR label induces shame and internalized stigma due to stereotypes of psychosis. So this quote's powerful. When I first came to COPE, negative theme, this is interesting actually, structural discrimination. So here there are fears of being treated differently in institutions due to the CHR label. And this is probably one of the most, I hate to order them, but this is the hardest one to get rid of, right? Because once you're sort of labeled in an institution, that's really hard to get rid of. So this youth says, the whole notion that I may have schizophrenia someday, will I be able to achieve certain things I set out to do? Government rules for security clearance are based on mental stability. The fact I was once on antipsychotic drugs is on my record forever. Even if I successfully recover and I want to get a job in government, it would still be on my record. And this is a realistic, this was a college student at a pretty high-level university, so it's actually a realistic concern for him, this person. And then the fourth most common, I guess again not surprising, is anticipated stigma and discrimination. 22% of youth endorse this, and this is expecting that people will treat you differently due to the CHR label. And actually, this was an interesting finding that actually emerged all throughout. This is a segue for a second. When you tell the youth they're at risk for psychosis, they get it. They're like, okay, I don't have psychosis, but I'm at risk for it. But when they have to tell other people they're at risk for psychosis, other people are very likely to misconstrue that. And the youth is very afraid of that. So here you can see, so if I tell them I'm at risk for developing psychosis, they think of me as a mental patient because people can't differentiate, other people can't differentiate between the risk state and the actual diagnosis, and that they shouldn't be around me, they're afraid of me. So, I listed out the most positive and top positive, top negative. Let me get briefly into the co-occurrence. So, very interestingly, over half of the transcripts expressed overlap between the negative and positive themes. So 55% of transcripts. I'm just going to give you the top two. So, unsurprised, so 50% of the time when one code occurred, the other code occurred with it. And unsurprisingly, I guess kind of unsurprising, it's when the youth tells other people, on the one hand, people support them, so they get benefits from other people. But on the other hand, people think of them differently, so they have altered perceptions and sometimes negative responses. So they really go hand in hand. So I'll just jump to the quote. So the blue is positive, the red is negative. So to talk about my at-risk status, there was stigma I had. Growing up, there was family embarrassment about my family's mental disorders, mental illnesses. So the negative part, having this new status, getting the CHR label, also scared my mom as well. Okay, and especially this is about because his family has schizophrenia in it. My mom has a schizophrenic sister. Being identified as at risk equals people thinking you're at risk, really developing something. I sometimes use coming to cope as a way to convey the severity of my problems. People try to be supportive. People make extra efforts. They would check in on me more. So here you can see both things are happening at once, both the positive and the negative. The second most commonly co-occurrence is accurate understanding of the risk status co-occurs with the perceived exacerbation of the experiences themselves. So that's kind of regrettable, but this is our second most common overlap. So essentially, when you tell the youth, right, they get it. They're like, okay, well, risk is different than having a disease, so I get that. But then they start monitoring themselves, for the progression of the illness. So, I'll jump to the quote again. I now know that being CHR conveys a slightly greater risk for disease. So here, the person's clear, I'm at risk, I don't have the disease. But it's a very complicated concept to explain to people. Dr. Kelly, the psychiatrist at the CHR program, asked me about perceptual difficulties. I worried that these might be signs of psychosis, but now I can talk about it. At first identification, I was more worried because I thought it meant I was psychotic, and that there was an increase in the possibility that the psychosis is really happening. Okay, so I'm going to jump to now I'm going to wrap up with the discussion and then invite you all to join in a discussion. So in terms of the quantitative findings, what we found, which form of stigma is higher? So the label stigma versus the symptom stigma. And there are mixed findings here. The symptom stigma is higher in regards to the shame, if you remember from that first slide, but then the labeling secrecy is higher, right, than the symptom secrecy. So both are present, both are acting. Which form of stigma is more strongly associated with the negative outcomes? Well, out of 6 positive associations, 4 have symptom stigma as more powerful correlate. And this adds to findings, obviously, that stigma matters for CHR, because any form of stigma is bad, even stigma towards symptoms, right? Because as people come in, they're symptomatic, probably are reticent to come into services because they don't feel good about themselves. But on balance, symptom stigma, because it is more salient, we can target that, right? We can target that in the earliest treatment, mitigate the symptoms, then accordingly reduce the stigma. However, labeling stigma is present. 2 out of the 6, it's not to say it's not there. 2 out of 6 findings indicate labeling stigma is salient. And secondly, it may grow as youth become more familiar with their identification status. So we'll be able to look at this in 6 months, and we're in the midst of analyzing this data now. For the qualitative findings, being told that one is at risk for psychosis is most likely linked with positive and negative experiences, which commonly overlap. And I think this is a really important and powerful lesson, especially for the folks who interact, right, with people with mental illnesses and have to convey the diagnosis, that these two things often, really go hand in hand with one another. And so our goal really as practitioners and researchers is to minimize the negative effects while accentuating the positive benefits of CHR identification. And so some implications, some just initial implications for clinical care, and again, I'd love to engage with this body of accomplished psychiatrists and other practitioners in this topic. First of all, that specialized CHR programs could be careful to avoid a singular focus on psychosis risk. We care a lot about psychosis risk and preventing it, but the youth oftentimes come in with other sorts of problems. And in a prior paper that we just published this year, youth were actually more concerned about their non-psychotic problems, and that those were getting worse. And then they would actually attach their psychosis experiences into them. So they'd say things like, oh, I'm getting more depressed, and then I'm starting to see shadows, and following me around, etc. But they actually weave it into their non-psychotic experiences. We do want to help youth see their insight into their CHR symptoms as a strength, because this is actually, because their insight is what gives us the window for early intervention, right? Because they're aware, they're getting worse, we can engage with them, they can come into services. And this could enable them to engage in treatment that can reduce their risk, and to also, from the qualitative findings, to receive beneficial support from others. And then lastly, while it's important for engagement, we need to recognize also that being identified as at risk for psychosis may adversely impact individuals' sense of self and anticipated treatment from other people once they tell them they're at risk for psychosis. So it's this notion that the negative comes hand in hand with the positive, and that we should just be aware that there's a strong possibility that that could be occurring as well as all the positive things that are happening in treatment. We are currently working to address this through a CHR stigma intervention. I'm working with Alicia Luxted, who developed the Ending Internalized Stigma intervention to maximize the benefits of early site identification. We piloted this group in one set of respondents. We're actually going to try to move it to a computerized platform to be continued, and we're in development. So just to wrap up, just acknowledgements. I want to, of course, acknowledge my collaborators on this project, which have been just tremendous. Kristen Woodbury at Harvard, Bill McFarland at Maine Medical Center, Cheryl Corcoran, Bruce Link, and Roger Jurgis. I especially want to single out my beloved mentor, Larry Simon, whose picture is here. Larry passed away 2 years ago, and left us far too soon. And I always dedicate my talks to him because he was the first person who really believed in me and gave me a chance to pursue this very important topic. And so I know he's looking down on us and giving his blessing. So thank you very much for your time. And I look forward to having an engaging discussion.
Thank you.